Okay, so here we are. We're in our final video of chapter 22. So in the previous videos, we've looked kind of at the rebirth of China to an extent. We looked at kind of the rebirth and growth of Europe, both within the Renaissance, but also within exploration and state power. And so we're going to continue on with the exploration piece, and then, or as they go into further to the Pacific with the Spanish, and then we'll change trajectories over towards the Atlantic, talk about the Columbian Exchange, and then kind of overall takeaways from chapter 22. So within, Spain and the Philippines. So Spain has slowly been kind of retaking over its territory. Same thing with Portugal from the Muslims, for the last 700 years, going into the end of the 1490s. And so, for the most part, Spain is primarily back in the hands of Christians by the mid 1300s. But there's just like one little sliver down here, and so it's through the union of Ferdinand and Isabella with the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, as they get married and unite their forces, and they're able to finally retake all of Spain within the Reconquista and completing it, and then being able to, essentially unite Spain, or attempt to unite Spain through exploration and catch up to their Portuguese neighbors, with Portugal being right here. All right, so their big area out into the east, down to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, is the Philippines. So this is at the same time that Columbus is sailing, westward into the Americas, and Spanish explorers are starting to go over to the Aztec and the Incas in the 15 teens. The Spanish are able to do the same and kind of head. Magellan takes his trip, or at least his ships and his sailors and crews, end up in the Philippines in the early 1500s. Magellan does not complete the trip, but again, it's kind of the whole thing about the Spanish, traversing the world at the same time. So we talked about in the previous video with Portugal, setting up their trading post empire throughout the Indian Ocean, and not really expanding upon that. Spain, however, decides to actually set up an actual empire and legislation and control over the islands, or to take as much control as they can. So one of the big reasons they're able to take control of the Philippines is because it is a massive amount of island chains that are not completely united. So you might have one group that conquers one island, another group that's in charge of another island, and so the Spanish are able to take advantage of that through the use of technology and weapons with their ships, with the cannons and things like that. And your only real struggle are against two areas. One, the southern island of Mindanao, right down here, which actually still is an area of controversy today, even when the Americans take over as well. With the Muslim population that is a majority down there. The rest of the islands are predominantly Christian Catholic as a result of their connection to Spain. But it's essentially a sticking point where they were able to remain fairly independent, and then people up in the highlands of the Philippines and the areas that were harder to reach, more difficult, also were relatively independent or were fighting for independence. But anyway, so for the most part, the Philippines fall to the Spanish. So the Spanish enforced language. They should enforce the Spanish language on the population, predominantly in city centers and urban areas, and bring more people to the urban areas, or try to convince them to come to the urban areas to take more control, and convert a lot to Christianity through missionaries. So very similar within the use of, when we talked about the Sufi mystics within Asia with Islam, very, very similar within that. And so they also use prominent local leaders who they convert, relocation of peoples to, again, those urban centers, and the building of schools to convince them to, push Christianity as well as the Spanish language. So they're able to control most of the dense urban areas throughout the entire island chain. All right. So, again, what we said with that previous video, what were Europeans after? It was Christians and spices. Okay. So the big thing, though, what the Philippines are going to offer is not spices. It's actually going to be a sort of a mixture trading point for the Spanish to get Chinese goods and in exchange for silver. Silver, again, going to be something we're going to talk about more. And there's more specific notes, specific video, or specific PowerPoint related just to the silver and fur trade. All right. So Manila, which became the capital of the Philippines as a result of the Spanish and is still the capital today, is the center of trade thanks to silk from the Chinese merchants, because, here's the Philippines, here is China with all of its dense populations on the coasts, easy access to the trade. All right, so the Chinese merchants conduct most of the trade, but are often persecuted and massacred by, Spanish people who do not trust them. The silk is then brought to Mexico, and in exchange, the silver is brought from Mexico and from Colombia to the Philippines in exchange, because that is what the Chinese are only trading in, is silver at this point, and later on it'll be gold. But essentially, again, as we said in the previous video, the Chinese are not at all interested in European goods. Not at all. But silver and gold are things that they, take advantage of and can see like, hey, there is value and there is worth in this, and that's what they really care for. So this gets more of the goods, to the Americas and then over to Europe. And then in many cases, they'll ship the stuff over to Japan for more silver, things like that. Brought over by the Spanish and Manila galleons, being the same thing. So the map down here kind of shows you that trade. Again, using those routes following, currents and winds and things like that to get it from there. All right. So then we'll do this more in class, looking at actually Columbus, talking about, his discovering quotation marks. You can't really discover something that already has millions of people, and the effects that that's going to have at a later time, with the effects that this will have, obviously in the Americas and the arrival of the Spanish. We'll talk about that more in the next chapter as a result. But we'll kind of briefly mention this here too. One of the unfortunate things that we're going to find or see is the expansion of the slave trade, which again we will bring more into in future chapters for the reasons why this occurs. But essentially, sugarcane has been developed throughout the majority of the Muslim territories and also within India, and was brought over to areas in Europe. So again, Sicily, within southern Spain, and then they begin to put them into the islands that the Portuguese have been using. And they're like, hey, we can make plantations of this, and they were using the people to do that. And so they will bring over African slaves to replace the indigenous peoples that they use for slaves. Again, we'll talk more about that later on. In order to have them work on those plantations, because sugarcane can be used to make, sugar, rum, molasses, and livestock feed, which has a lot of uses. All right, and things that they can make more money on. And so what they'll do, and again, we'll talk more about this within Africa, what they're trading for to get more African slaves to work on the plantations were, guns and textiles, as well as, the Europeans also picking up not only slaves, but also gold as a result. And so this would expand the African slave trade, which had been going on for a long time, but the Europeans bring it to a whole nother level due to the demand of labor that they are looking for. All right. And so the reason why African tribes are doing this is because of long-standing rivalries, but it changes the whole nature of it with the Europeans, which again we will sort of expand on. So you can kind of see the maps here, the various colonies that kind of get brought up, as well as the trading post areas that you can kind of see that we've kind of already looked at a little bit. You get some of the oceanic travels of Da Gama, of Magellan, Columbus, Cabot, coming over from England and a few other places as well. But then you also got these international trades of where things are going. Where is silver coming from? Well, it's coming from essentially, Central America and bits of South America as well. Where are the silks going? How are they getting there? Same thing with sugar and the other locations, right? And then also where the majority of the African slaves are going to be going. It's not the United States. Despite the fact that we have a very large, slave system, the majority go into Brazil and into the Caribbean, which we will again talk about more in depth at a later time. So one of the big resulting things as a result of this expansion of trade, once they talk about the Americas and getting over there and making a long-lasting impact, is known as the Columbian exchange, which is the transfer of people, animals, plants, and diseases between the new and old worlds. And if this is familiar from U.S. history, it should be. And you can kind of see what was brought over from Africa, Europe, and Asia to the Americas, and then vice versa from the Americas back to those places. All right. So we're not going to really talk about that, but we're going to talk about the more effects of it. All right. So in this case, with the demographic changes, those diseases, smallpox, typhus, and influenza, New World people, or the indigenous peoples of the Americas, don't really have immunity against them. So it kills a lot of them off, on top of the warfare brought over by the Spaniards and the Portuguese, and also the labor systems that we're going to talk about later on. So lost about 75% of the population inside the Mayan and Incan regions, occupied by the Spanish, and then the Brazilian population is about 50%. There's no way of knowing how many people were affected here kind of in the United States and Canada, but again, very high numbers, and that will grow as a result later on. But the big transfer was beyond just the population pieces of, how the diseases affect them. So the exchange is east and west. So you can kind of, again, see what's brought from one place to the other. Okay, this is what's brought from Southern Europe. This is brought from Africa, from America. But what this actually leads to, all right, the spread of crops and animals increases their diets due to better nourishment, and that will increase overall population because now you have more stable food supplies, different types of carbohydrates and proteins being brought over. Again, better things for settled societies, and that will improve, nourishment, nutrients, life expectancy. So that will actually lead to a lot of, positives, even though we do talk about the negatives as a result. So overall long-term effects of European exploration with the Mongols of the seas, because typically they are the ones dominating the, trade routes like the Mongols had over the land, but now this is over the water routes. Okay. We see the spread of Christianity as well as European languages into Asia and the Americas, hence why we see English, French, Dutch, Spanish spoken where it is globally. Okay, as well as Christianity, particularly Roman Catholicism. All right, think about areas where Spain was very big, as well as Portugal. Okay, most of those are Roman Catholic countries. Okay, we unfortunately see in the millions upon millions of people dying who are indigenous Americans due to disease, labor, and war, and the migrations to Americas, both voluntary from Europe. So think people moving on their own. Think indentured servitude within the United States, within the 13 colonies, and then slavery from Africa going into the Caribbean and into Brazil. Other things occur. There's a big increase in trade and the demand of goods because, again, you have greater access because Europeans are now funding those expeditions. They are trying to set up their own establishment and trading posts. So again, the increasing trade of silk, spices, silver, and gold, and others means that there's there's an actual global trade network going on for the very first time in history that really now with the Americas brings in the entirety of the globe within this, with Europe now in control of much of it, either because their government's in control of places or because of those independent companies like the British or Dutch East India companies. Europeans begin to emphasize mercantilism, depending on how you say it. Okay, so that's essentially, with the formation of colonies, they want to make sure that the colonies are essentially tied to the home country. So like with England and the 13 colonies, making sure that the 13 colonies are reliant upon England by essentially throwing up high tariffs, but also making sure that the colonies essentially just have to trade with the home country, right? But also trying to export and make as much money as possible with your finished products. So think clothing, textiles, right? So yeah, and then limiting their means to trade with other people, which is, we got to see how that worked out in the United States when we didn't like that leading up to the revolution as one big factor. There's also, as we said, increased competition between the European states and companies and Europe to hold on to the world, pushing for more regional rivalries for those trying to benefit them. So Europeans playing Africans and Asian peoples against each other, which again, we will talk more about later on. As a result, this is something there again within that video or the notes that'll be up on the silver trade. There's also on the big fur trade expansion, both within Siberia and within North America, because of a thing called the Little Ice Age that occurs kind of in the 1600s, where it becomes really, really cold for a few decades. And that ends up leading to people looking out for furs, animal pelts to keep themselves warm, but it's also in fashion at the time. So that leads to obviously more animals going near extinction, things like the beaver and other types of, woolly animals to keep themselves warm, but also overharvesting of other animals such as whales, deer, and cod on the American continent, cutting down of forests for housing and ships both in the Americas, but also in other parts of the globe as populations expand. Mining here in the Americas, again, coming back to the silver stuff, all permanently changing environments and ecosystems, all right? There's new technologies, as we've kind of established before, the increase in trade of crops and animals leading to that overall long-term population growth. Indians now using horses for hunting, but that also limits the role of women because, men are now seen as the kind of the essential warrior riding type. And this will, in both the short and long term, okay, create further inequitable labor and social class systems, which again, we will expand upon later on. So that covers essentially the big stuff out of chapter 22, which also brings us to springboard points for, further chapters later on down the road. So hopefully they kind of take those away from this one, and then kind of here's our quick map to kind of really close it out. Silver trade here on the left, and then the fur trade in the Americas on the right, and where they were going, things related to that, which again we will expand upon later on.